Okay, I think we can get started. Good evening and welcome to This Conjuncture. This is a seminar series exploring the key issues that define our current moment. And this series is brought to you by New Formations, a journal of culture, theory and politics. I'm Rebecca Bramall. I'm a member of the editorial board of New Formations. And along with Jeremy Gilbert, I've organised this series. We're going to be chairing several of the events in the series along with other members of the editorial board. And there's a seminar every Monday evening until the 8th of November, and you're very welcome to attend every week. You can use the same link that you used today and also sign up on the website. This evening, we're going to be discussing Merkelism as a mode of political crisis management, and no doubt also yesterday's election results. We're joined by Moritz Ege and Alexander Gallas. And we also hope to hear from you, our audience, later in the seminar. So let's introduce our speakers. Really delighted to be joined by Moritz Ege, Professor of Cultural Studies and Popular Cultures at the University of Zurich. Moritz works on popular culture, urban life, and everyday consumption and economics. And he's the author of many publications, but most recently he has co-edited 2 books, Urban Ethics, Conflicts over the Good and Proper Life in Cities, and Against the Elites, the Cultural Politics of Anti-Elitism. And both of these books are out this year or forthcoming this year. Also delighted to be joined by Alex Gallas, Assistant Professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Kassel. He's also one of the editors of the Global Labour Journal, and Alex works in the areas of labour studies, class analysis and state theory. He's the author of the Thatcherite Offensive and Neo-Poulantzasian Analysis, and he's also a founding member of a working group dedicated to conjunctural analysis. So Moritz and Alex are the co-authors of a fantastic article titled The Exhaustion of Merkelism, a conjunctural analysis, which we published in New Formations in 2019. And that article is free to download and to read from our website. And we wanted to bring them back really to hear about how their analysis might be extended in the light of the developments of the last 18 months or so. So they're going to give a joint presentation for about 50 minutes, and then there'll be plenty of time to open up for questions to Moritz and Alex, and also discussion between ourselves. So over to you both, okay? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us. I've prepared a PowerPoint, so if you can turn me into a co-host or enable that function, I might be able to share my screen.
Yeah, let's do that. Jeremy, can you do that?
Sorry, I'm just fiddling with it. Okay, it should work now.
Yeah, thank you. Can you see this?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so thanks very much for being here and for this invitation to revisit our article and comment on yesterday's elections. I have to say, it's all sewn with a hot needle. We sat down today and put together this presentation because obviously until yesterday, we didn't know what the election result was going to be. So very excited to share this with you. And it's all, well, our old article combined with some new reflections on what's going on right now. We're going to start with the election results, then move into the article, and then reflect a little on some of the concepts that we've introduced in the articles, in particular, obviously the concept of Merkelism and, you know, the question of what's going on right now still can be captured with that concept, or something else is emerging. Let me start with the election. What you see here is the election result. For those of you who aren't familiar with German party politics, a few quick remarks. So we have proportional representation in Germany, which makes, in general, for a more fragmented kind of political system than you have it, say, in Britain. But in this result, this is pretty extreme for German standards. So we have 6 parties in parliament, and all of them fairly close to one another, maybe with the exception of the Left Party, which is a bit lower. Just to explain the parties very quickly, CDU, CSU is the Christian Democratic Bloc, consisting of 2 parties. It's Merkel's party. SPD is the Social Democratic Party, Center-Left Party. AfD is Alternative for Germany, a far-right party. FDP is a free market party, a radical free market party. They see themselves as centrist. I don't know whether that's an accurate representation of what they stand for. Then we have the Left Party, Democratic Socialist Party, to the left of Social Democracy, and the Green Party, which is a sort of centrist, left liberal force, and a lot more moderate than the British Green parties. So what's interesting about this result? Well, let's start with gains and losses. So what you can see here is that Merkel's bloc, CDU, CSU, have lost dramatically. It's the lowest ever result they've had in general elections in Germany since 1949, when the Federal Republic of Germany was founded. So it's the worst result by far for them. To the great surprise of many people, very, very few people would have predicted it a few weeks ago even. The SPD comes first, has gained quite a significant number of votes. The same goes for the Green Party. They have a record result, but some people were hoping for them to do even better and to really challenge for the chancellorship and for becoming the strongest political party in the country. So that's quite clearly not the case. And then possibly the last result of interest, the far right and the free marketeers are more or less the same level they were 4 years ago. A dramatic result for the Left Party. Very, very close to not even entering parliament, because there's a 5% threshold. I can explain details if people are interested later on, but they still managed to get in, but dramatic losses. Lost about half of their votes. Politics in Germany is about coalitions, which is a reflection of proportional representation. So what happens now is that parties start to reach out to one another and try to form coalitions. In the last 4 years, we've had a so-called grand coalition, which is not so grand anymore, between the 2 biggest party blocs, SPD and CDU, CSU, the Christian Democrats, led by the latter. Both sides more or less rule out at at the moment. This could change at a later point, but at this moment, they rule out getting together again. Also, all of the parties agree that they won't enter coalitions with the far right, which means there are essentially two options for coalitions, which you see here. One is a coalition led by the CDU-CSU with the Greens and the free market FDP, and the other one is the same thing led by the Social Democrats without the Christian Democrats. So far it's completely open what's going to happen. What is pretty clear is that the two smaller parties involved, so the Green Party and the FDP, are already starting informal talks. And their idea is that they first get together and start talking and discussing what a common platform could be before they involve the two big parties in their talks. So this is what's happening right now already. There is this alignment between those two forces, which is interesting because usually, despite the fact that, arguably you could say that both parties aren't so far off from one another, especially in terms of the social backgrounds of their voters and so forth, they're involved in quite fierce confrontations against each other. So now I'm going to hand over to Moritz, who's going to explain a little what we did in our article.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so a few years ago, we wrote this article on what we called the exhaustion of Merkelism, and it was an attempt to do a conjunctural analysis, sort of following in a relatively orthodox way in the footsteps of books like Policing the Crisis by Stuart Hall and others, and some works that came later. And Merkelism, first of all, we defined as a dominant strategy of political crisis management in Germany. Merkel became Chancellor in 2005, sort of first starting out as a straightforward neoliberal, then sort of becoming a more moderate, social market-oriented centrist politician. There was, of course, the big 2007, 2008 banking and financial crisis. And we termed Merkelism the strategy of dealing with especially what follows from that crisis, or has followed since 2007, 2008. Won't get into it too deeply. We looked at sort of different levels, economy, politics, culture. In economic terms, Merkelism is sort of the in continuity with the German older German accumulation regime and strategy of export-oriented businesses, competitive corporatism, so some forms of consensus-finding corporatism on the inside, but sort of a clear competitive national state oriented towards export of industrial goods and consumer goods, but very much industrial goods too. As everyone knows, in the EU crises recently and 2015, and with Greece especially, Germany strongly prescribed austerity within the EU, but at the same time, it did do sort of counter-cyclical interventions for the economy at home. Another sort of a crucial argument for our paper was the idea of the co-optation of core workforces, the idea that large parts of the sort of more or less traditional industrial working class in Germany, which is large, are co-opted into this economic model because their interests align to some extent with the interest of the export-oriented economy. And to some extent, they've tended to support relatively conservative centrist politicians, whether not necessarily Merkel, but conservative social democrats often. In the political realm, which is sort of when people talk about Merkelism in Germany, which they don't very often, but when the word comes up, it's mostly seen as a form of depoliticizing the political sphere. The term is often asymmetric demobilization. The idea is that basically you bore your opponents to death, so they won't even bother to go to the polls. And that worked for Merkel quite well, sort of a technocratic approach to problem solving, to politics. A general idea of there are no alternatives, things are alternativlos, devoid of alternatives. At the same time, she has also stood for sudden U-turns in line with shifts in the public moods, the most spectacular one being the decision to end nuclear power plants, nuclear energy after the Fukushima catastrophe, which is something that Greens had demanded for a long time, but which was completely anathematic to conservatives. And there are other examples of this as well. Also, she's been able to unite a fairly broad party political consensus together with social democrats who were sort of in the neoliberal, new labor, third way politics style, and also with sort of the Greens who've become more conservative. So relatively little political competition within this sort of mode of Merkelism. In the cultural sphere, we pointed out a number of things. Perhaps most importantly at this point, Merkel was not a very conservative. She moderated processes of societal liberalization. Germany, up until before her, in the last Schröder government, had a very conservative citizenship legal system. So being German was defined for a very long time for very many conservatives by German ethnic heritage. That changed toward a sort of more of a passport-based system. And there are other examples of anti-discrimination laws and gay and lesbian marriage where Merkel presided over a liberalization of cultural rules. She also, at the same time, of course, made many concessions to cultural conservatives. Now, we could say a lot more about this, but we want to get to the present. The term exhaustion we took also from Policing the Crisis. I think they took it from Gramsci, who somewhere writes that social groups at some point exhaust their function in a historical process. The idea is that consent is something like a resource for governments and or for projects and blocks, and at some point consent becomes exhausted. This is also, I think, the case with Merkelism. Merkelism was a fairly stable formation during a relatively long phase of that crisis within Germany. So 2007 to 2015, there was relatively little opposition within Germany comparatively, especially when compared to other places in Europe during that time. However, after the summer of migration in 2015, when Merkel famously decided not to close the border, basically all hell broke loose and consensus pretty much ended, which, you know, from our view, of course, that was not a wrong decision to take at all, but it was one that basically ended the consensus model of Merkelism, because there was a quick rise of the conservative opposition, the rise of the Alternative für Deutschland. There was a strong polarization of civil society in different fields. We sort of tried to periodize this exhaustion of Merkelism and its well, in different phases after 2015. So basically we predicted, or we said, well, Merkelism, there's so much strife, there's so much polarization at this point. Merkelism is over, it's in agony, and to some extent, obviously the CDU lost the election, but at the same time, there are quite a few indicators to why one should think that Merkelism actually is entering a new phase, perhaps. So Merkel in Germany is famous for this gesture, die Merkel-Raute, the rhombus, and a few months ago, Olaf Scholz, who is now very likely to become Chancellor, took up this pose for a news magazine, photograph sort of symbolizing the continuity that he aspires to. So Germany continues to be somewhat of an unusual case within parts of Europe. It is very likely that there's going to be another centrist government, or it's actually sure that there's going to be another centrist government. The three contenders were all centrists. So Laschet from the CDU, Scholz from the SPD, and Baerbock from the Greens as well. There was basically no right-wing populist real contender. Also, I think what's quite important, the center-right in Germany will not form coalitions with the far right at this point. I mean, who knows how long this will last, but this is definitely a strong strategic disadvantage for conservatives at this point, because they lost many voters in that direction, but cannot use those votes in parliament to get elected. So within all the upheavals in different countries, sort of the politics of anger that is talked about so much, and sort of the crazy figures of politics and the emotional upheavals, both Merkel and Scholz really embody a very calm, emotional style. They're very boring. And Scholz definitely sort of embodies continuity, as we saw in that image, or sort of, I mean, that's sort of a tongue-in-cheek thing, but he very strongly stands for continuity. He was the Minister of Finance under Merkel for some time. And he also promises change, of course. What's perhaps also somewhat unusual is just how weak the opposition is, especially when it comes to the losses of the left party. A few more indicators why actually how the center sort of holds in this situation. There is a widespread rhetoric of economic modernization. Germany needs to be modernized. We're still using fax machines in the public administration. That's something that basically all parties unite in. We could speak of sort of the idea of revitalizing and bringing up to date competitive corporatism as sort of a national project that all parties pretty much agree on. There is an international discourse, of course, of Germany as a guardian of European stability. Merkel is a much beloved figure among sort of centrists and liberals internationally, and that definitely sort of feeds back into the German discourse as well, where the idea is that, well, we need to continue this position. We could also say that that the management of the Corona crisis has also again co-opted sort of some left forces into Merkel's relatively rational governance style, so that it could be the case that either Scholz or Laschet would be a new phase of Merkelism, would represent that. The image that you see there sort of represents these processes of co-optation. Somebody wrote "Merkel muss weg," which is a sort of a standard slogan of right-wingers. Merkel must go. The Pegida demonstrators, sort of anti-immigrant demonstrators, used that a lot. Merkel muss weg. And left-wingers crossed it out and wrote Antifa area over it, which is sort of makes intuitive sense, because as an anti-fascist, you're against people who think that Merkel should go, because you realize that they're most likely sort of anti-immigrant campaigners. At the same time, the idea that anti-fascism and supporting Merkel, sort of a staunch conservative in some ways, is just really confusing. And it's sort of typical for the ways in which left opposition movements have sort of aligned with Merkel on a lot of ways, because in a lot of ways, or in some ways, because there are mutual antagonists, mutual opponents on the radical right. So in all these ways, we could say there's a new phase of Merkelism. On the other hand, the term exhaustion is suddenly again very popular in the mainstream press. Der Spiegel last week, the title was Schlaffrot Gold, sort of limp, exhausted, red and gold instead of Schwarz-Rot Gold. The self-exhaustion of a party, the exhausted German eagle. It's an image that appears to make sense to a lot of people. What they mean there seems to be mostly economic matters. It's sort of anxieties over the national future. Sort of again, Germany becoming the sick man of Europe, fears of longer term economic decline of the car industry in terms of because of the end of fossil fuels, rising unemployment due to automation within industrial production, the further rise of China, the threat of EU finances, and Germany not being a terribly dynamic economic place all around. So in that sense, people are again talking about exhaustions, but of course not in the same way that we're using the term really. Back to Alex, I think.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, there's one connection, however, in this talk of exhaustion, Selbsterschöpfung einer Partei, the self-exhaustion of a party refers to party politics and to the fact that the CDU is so weak in this moment. And so we sort of discussed today, sitting down and thinking about this election results, do we actually see manifestations of exhaustion? Can we make a case for saying that we were still correct to say that there is a process of exhaustion of Merkelism going on? And what we did was we came up with 3 claims, observations that we want to put to you, discuss with you. Obviously, there are tentative observations made at this moment. We wrote them down today. So very first steps in terms of making sense of this conjunction in German politics, but we want to share them with you and discuss them with you, and also share some indications of why we think this is the case. So for the first one very much refers to party politics. And we say here is the political scene is becoming ever more fragmented, and there's a serious internal polarization of the main political parties. The important thing here is internal polarization, so not a polarization between parties so much, but internal tensions inside those parties. The party duopoly of the 2 large popular party blocks, so-called Volksparteien, or popular parties in Germany, has ceased to exist. And to show to you what's been going on historically, we have here the election results since 1949 of the 2 main party blocks, the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats. You see here that in 1976, which was incidentally my year of birth, it reached a record high of more than 90%, and since yesterday, for the first time ever, this has dropped down to less than 50%. So the 2 main party blocks make up less than 50% of the share of the votes overall, and you can see a continuous process of decline since the 1970s, which illustrates this process of fragmentation that we're talking about. That said, we've talked a lot about the election result of the left party and mentioned it here, and that surely a very, very serious setback for anyone who thinks about left alternatives to the status quo. But we also want to put forward something that we think gives the reasons for a slightly more optimistic view. There are some successes of the left broadly understood outside party politics. Social movements are springing up that make their demands with a great degree of urgency and force, and they shift discourses and force some concessions. The movements emerge in reaction to social and environmental limits to capital accumulation and the spatial fixes at the level of the national state. And here we have some examples of those movements. Bottom left, that's Friday, last Friday in Berlin, a huge demonstration that was called Climate Strike, that was part of the worldwide mobilization for climate justice. A very young and very strong movement in Germany right now, involving lots of teenagers and people who for the first time get involved in politics. Then another very exciting moment yesterday. A lot of people on the left were devastated by the result for the left party, but what also happened was there was a referendum over the demand that large housing corporations owning more than 3,000 units of housing in Berlin should be expropriated. And the vast majority of voters in Berlin said that this should be done. So 56%, I think, of voters in Berlin agreed to that proposal, which I think is a huge victory for people based in social movements around housing, around public housing, around fighting back the corporatization of housing. Unfortunately, this referendum is a legally based referendum, but not a legally binding referendum. So we're going to see what happens, but it puts a lot of pressure on the next government of the city-state of Berlin to implement something, do something with it. We've also seen quite a few important anti-racist interventions in recent years, and we are in the midst of a strike wave right now. So we've had quite strong, or are having right now quite strong strikes in the railway sector, at hospitals, in the retail sector. So there's a lot going on, if you will, underneath the level of the political scene and party politics. Yeah, over to you, Moritz.
Well, so we're still going through sort of these different points where we think that there clearly is no consensus, or sort of the idea that something like a strategy like Merkelism could re-emerge, where consensus building plays such a huge role. Now, this probably seems very familiar to an international audience. Some of this is going on pretty much everywhere, but it's quite different from the Merkelist paradigm. So there are a lot of struggles going on over everyday politics or everyday ethics. There are loud demands for justice when it comes to issues of gender and racism, especially. The right wing in Germany too construes them as culture wars of paternalistic, woke left urban elites and so forth. They're very, well, relatively quick at adapting those words from English against ordinary people, following an international playbook of mobilizing common sense, mobilizing resentments, and also particularist interests against potential cross-class, cross-milieu left alliances. So there are attacks against feminists, there are attacks against women, attacks against Muslims, against left intellectuals, against environmentalists. And there is a sort of a broad alliance, sort of a strange one, of right-wing liberals, far-right activists, sort of highbrow centrist intellectuals in the big dailies and weekly journals, and also quite a few left-wing populists. against what they call woke culture and so forth. I mean, it's a complex issue, and there are some arguments that are probably more supportable than others. But overall, there is sort of a manufactured culture war going on. It's very obvious. The most obvious one was, there's the cancel culture, moral panics, which sort of basically without any evidence of anyone being canceled for anything, still sort of brings up new articles and position papers, and sort of keeps right-wing activists and journalists busy. The most ridiculous, I think, example was the Currywurst debate when the Volkswagen plant in Wolfsburg announced that one of their cafeterias for workers would become vegetarian. People said that the most popular dish in German cafeterias, which is the Currywurst, a Bratwurst with curry ketchup and French fries, would no longer be available. And people like Gerhard Schröder rose to the defense of the Currywurst in that one cafeteria in Wolfsburg, calling it the power bar of the German worker, or of the Facharbeiter. And producing images like this one. So the general idea of the defense of normal, straight, white German men and their way of life against the assault from these crazy people. So we're mentioning this, I mean, none of this is new, but it is quite a polarized debate. People in the FDP, for example, are quite involved in this. The usual target, they usually connect this also with the Greens. Them finding together seems somewhat difficult, I would say. I mean, not impossible at all, but there is definitely no consensus there. A lot of this, of course, is related to media dynamics, to what Slobodian called incitement capitalism. So the production of micro scandals and anger for basic reasons of social media dynamics. In the German case, that's of course the case too, with sort of in the more extreme ends, the platforms like Telegram are very important. But there's also the tabloid dynamics and the Springer publishing house, sort of traditionally the conservative German publishing house that publishes the most important tabloid Bild. And sort of their more respectable middle-class newspaper Welt. They're really invested in this game. And they've just recently started their own TV or internet-based TV channel, Bild TV, because there was nothing like nothing exactly like the far right channels in other countries, and sort of this is everyone's or one big worry that this will be sort of a German version of Fox News or Newsmax or one of these things. They're definitely sort of trying something similar. It's a bit more complicated, but they're big in this in manufacturing culture wars as well. One more point there. Of course, we need to speak about the recent coronavirus dynamics and the managing the pandemic. We just want to get into one aspect here briefly. The corona crisis has certainly deepened in already existing inequalities and polarizations and fissures. That development is overshadowed at the level of discourse and of political mobilization by those manufactured culture wars. So when in our article, we really stressed dynamics of migration and anti-migrant campaigns. In the last year and a half, the corona measures and anti-corona measures dynamics have really sort of superseded that questions, and they've produced quite a different sort of political frontier. So the far right, free marketeers, libertarians, and the so-called diagonalists or lateral thinkers, Querdenkers, as they call themselves, are also accusing the elite of betraying the people, of fostering a climate of fear in order to curtail freedoms and impose a dictatorial regime. And that new sort of political camp is combining authoritarian and also anti-authoritarian rhetorical patterns in quite interesting and new ways. I mean, this is of course not specific only to Germany. Similar movements are perhaps stronger in France. They're strong in Austria and Switzerland too, and they do not make up a huge group, but they're significant nevertheless. Moving on, we should keep in mind sort of definitely something of a class dynamic, as you probably all know, to the financial losses that people suffered during the pandemic. This is a slightly complicated visual here. So on the left, you have the net income, people with relatively low net incomes, below 900 euros on the left, and then going up to about 4,500 on the right. In red, you see, as people were asked, did you incur financial losses during Corona times? People who said yes, I did, were marked red here. So you can see that poorer people suffered losses. About 50% of people making less than 900 euros suffered losses, whereas only about 25% of people making more than 4,500 euros suffered losses. And so that's the red-green bar, and the blue, different tones of blue measure the quantity of those losses, and the light, the dark blue, the darker means the higher quantity, and the light blue, lower quantity. So in the same way, you see that people suffering more are much more strongly represented among people making less money overall. So that's just sort of a reminder of some of those the material dynamics. I mean, there are well-known gender dynamics as well. We'll briefly, so these Querdenker, diagonalist movement people who agitate against against people working against the pandemic and sort of want herd immunity and people or believe that there is no such thing as a pandemic, who believe that vaccinations follow a plan of sort of a great replacement plan or things like that. They claim to represent general discontent and collective suffering, economic suffering, like the one I've just spoken about. They actually represent mostly sort of middle and upper middle class milieus. As far as is known, there were two bigger studies about this, but not really conclusive. But most of the people who were interviewed there said that they themselves did not really incur any losses, but they want to speak for people who do. They focus on alternative knowledge, sort of conspiracy thought of different kinds. They move away from mainstream institutions, also from mainstream sort of language use and vocabularies. They have no clear-cut political allegiances. Many of them come from, so there's different subgroups within them. Within that movement, there are sort of hardcore right-wing people. There are many people who previously voted for the Greens or even for the left, who sort of represent, in Germany, the anthroposophy movement is quite strong, sort of the Waldorf school, esoteric formation. They're quite strongly represented here as well, and some other sort of harder to define groups. Most of them, during sort of their career within that protest movement, move towards the political right personally, so they are become more likely to vote for the AfD. and they converge with the far right. So they definitely give a lot of space to neo-fascists and the like. We, at this point, do not actually see a clear influence on the elections here. I mean, they started their own small party, Die Basis. It was pretty far from crossing the 5% threshold, but maybe we'll know more about this in a few weeks. I think one effect that the Querdenken movement definitely had was to strengthen cohesion among their opponents. So they're definitely sort of, I mean, they are quite horrible, but they're also sort of a convenient folk devil where sort of the rational people of all stripes can unite against. They're also becoming more radical. Than one person who sort of identifies with that movement recently shot somebody who asked them to wear a mask indoor. So again, this is really pretty far away from any sort of consensus building, and it's sort of that form of discontent is really springing up among people who previously would not have been seen as candidates for radical discontent, or at least many of them.
Okay, so let me wrap up things. What comes after Merkelism? Are we even at a point where Merkelism is over? Some tentative thoughts. Our colleague Sonja Buckel observed recently that we are in a moment that is characterized by a de-routinization across all sorts of domains in society. And I think that's a very valid point and a very important point. We see, and I think the examples show this, an erosion of consent and a weakness of the existing economic, political, and cultural institutions. So I think it's worth considering the old Gramscian term, also taken up by Stuart Hall, of an economic crisis, and see whether we can say that all these different crisis tendencies become aligned and possibly even reinforce themselves. That said, it's an open situation. It's complicated. A lot of things are going on at the same time. A lot of contradictions are visible. And that leads me to our table on Merkelism and the characteristics of Merkelism. What you have here on the left-hand side is essentially the table we shared with you a few minutes ago. So the different aspects of Merkelism in our analysis from 2019. And then on the right-hand side, we're trying to point out some contradictions that we're seeing right now, that we're observing right now, that we think at least indicate that we could be at a point where Merkelism is coming to a close, where something new is emerging. We frame them as contradictions, however, because we also see elements of continuity. I think we need to debate how to weigh up those elements of continuity and elements of discontinuity. So we could argue that this whole idea of industrial modernization, of green capitalism that is now put forward by the mainstream parties with different emphases, however, on how this can be done, signals a degree of continuity. At the same time, we see quite a few economic crisis tendencies that may undermine any sort of attempt to keep going or to move towards a revival of, I guess, an industry-based competitive corporatist accumulation regime that we've seen in Germany with a new green, I don't know, element. There's weak demand thanks to deepening inequality. There's a serious problem with underinvestment in production, but also underinvestment in the infrastructure. It seems very difficult to enforce change in industry because the relations of forces are so that labor is weak, that it's very, very hard to demand fundamental change from the side of capital. And obviously all the issues that we were talking about post 2007, 2008 with financial bubbles, with a lot of investment flowing into the financial sectors are still there and are still creating serious economic tensions. At the level of politics, yes, we see this tendency to build centrist coalitions, and you could read that as a continuation of Merkelism. You can argue that non-centrist political forces are not strong and that this is reflected in the election result. On the other hand, the parties now taking the lead in the coalition talks are parties that have not been at the center of things, at least in the last 4 years. We're not part of the governing coalition, and they talk a lot about the need for change and for renewal. We have serious infighting. I think that's a very important point inside all the main parties. So every single party can be named here. If you look at the CDU, for example, there is a staunchly conservative nationalist wing that is very, very much questioning what they see as a turn to the left, and they say the decline of the CDU is due to this turn to the left, but also people very, very, very much emphasizing the need for continuity with Merkelism. If you turn to the SPD, you have a wing that Olaf Scholz very much stands for, which is very, very strongly influenced by New Labour as well, which sees the legacy of Gerhard Schröder's government in the late 1990s, early 2000s as something important and something that needs to be protected, which was really an onslaught on the working classes in Germany, facilitated by social democratic and green government. But the left of the SPD is very critical and says we need to move away from that model and we need to break with neoliberalism. And you can make similar arguments about all the other parties, if you will. They are dividing lines. And at the level of culture, I guess there is this idea, this appeal to calm, to a rational mode of conducting yourself, a science-based approach to the world and to politics, to moderate progress, and at the same time, this urgency of demands for change, obviously in many ways also linked to the climate justice movement, but then also on the right-hand side of the spectrum, this phenomenon of incitement capitalism, of manufactured culture wars, of the anger against woke people, so-called cancel culture, and so forth. This brings me hopefully to my final slide. Here we go. I guess what the big question is there a new political project, of crisis management emerging? And it seems at least that it is very, very difficult at this moment to create something coherent that addresses the different crisis tendencies. It also seems to be the case that there's no consensus among centrist forces what that kind of project could be. The CDU and the Free Democratic Party very much advocated market-based solutions to climate change. It was a bit ridiculous. They essentially said technology is going to save us, it's a technological innovation whereas the Green Party and the SPD very much stress the need for serious re-regulation without obviously breaking with market principles and with the principle of capital accumulation, but the type of regulated green capitalism. Also, if we look at alternative projects emerging on the right or the left of the political spectrum, it seems very difficult for them to cohere. Moritz already talked about Querdenken, which obviously is an important point of mobilization for the far right, which is incredibly contradictory. On the left, we have fierce debates around the need for left populism, around identity politics, around the question of where primary areas of political interventions lie, and so forth. So we end up with a situation of dispersed and displaced antagonisms, and I guess a very contradictory situation, which in my view somewhat points towards, there no longer being a dominant consensus-based mode of crisis management. That's to be discussed, and I'm very much looking forward to discussing this with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex and Moritz. You covered an enormous amount of ground there, and I know there's going to be a lot of questions for you. So, audience, you're very welcome at this point to put a question into the chat, or you could put your hand up if you wanted to actually speak. You're very welcome to. I think while people are just gathering their thoughts, when I was reading the article again today, I was thinking about the very astute remarks there about the left, and about a kind of an attempt amongst a certain faction in the left to accommodate a sort of communitarian or nationalist politics, really, a kind of left populist nationalist politics. And I wonder if really that's your explanation, this kind of split between the more international left and the communitarian faction. Is that really does that really play into the poor result for the left in the election yesterday?
Maybe I can start with, so basically the left populist faction did not win out the factional war within the left, really, but the left party did do a campaign that was strongly based on sort of class and social issues. But they did lose Wagenknecht, who's by far the most, aside from Gysi, but the most recognizable and popular face of the party. So that is part of it. There's a strong dynamic that doesn't really have much to do with sort of their strategy, which was that it was a sort of really tight race between Scholz and Laschet, who would get more votes, so that many people thought in order for there to be something like a potential red-green government, which would also have been possible, but with this result is not possible. So Social Democrats, Greens, and Left Party forming a coalition. If you want that to take place, you need a really strong result for the SPD. They need to be stronger than the CDU, because it's sort of a taboo to bring the left into government, largely because of their past as the East German Communist Party. So there was sort of some people changing sides from the left to the SPD, partly for that reason. But there are also sort of underlying strategic issues and just sort of not very good campaigning abilities in the left party, I would say. But I'm sure Alex knows more.
Yeah, what the leadership of the left party tried was what they called connecting class politics. And this was sort of an inclusive platform that somehow tried to connect traditional working class demands for improvements in the living situations and working situations of working people with the more so-called new social movement-based demands around climate change, around anti-racism, around gender equality and so forth. And it seems to me, I mean, we're still sort of discussing this, and it's very hard at this point to really pinpoint what it was, but it seems as if this kind of project didn't take off because it didn't have a very good story attached to it. It wasn't very clear what it meant to people, or it wasn't or leading politicians from the left weren't really able to score points in the political debates along those lines. So in a certain way, it seems from what I've seen from where the voters of the left have gone, a very, very sizable chunk is going to social democracy. And Moritz has given one reason for that. A very sizable chunk is going to the Green Party. But I also interpret this as the Green Party, despite being a very moderate and centrist force these days, being taken as a party that is committed to doing something about climate change, and the SPD, to a degree, having rediscovered its roots as a force that is, one of the eldest parties linked to the labor movement, obviously, in the world. So in that sense, to me it seems that this project, despite the fact that at an intellectual level I completely agree with the approach, that the campaigning didn't work in terms of translating this into something that led to mass support. And arguably, I guess the social movements in Berlin around housing did a much better job in advancing a very radical demand for the expropriation of big corporations than the left party.
I mean, that's one of the questions actually in the chat from Dorothea, who's asking about this strengthening of left movements and around more particular issues like housing, for example, and the corresponding decline of the left party. And she's wondering about a turn away from more institutionalized ways of doing things. So I wonder if that does tie in with your argument to some extent, that there is a certain energy around movement politics, which isn't there in the left at the moment.
Yeah, I think that it's the left is definitely devoid of energy, and that I think that's very true. So turn of left political actors away, yes, to some extent. At the same time, this is going to the polls, so this is not a very big demand. So I would assume that many people who are involved in social movement probably still voted for the left. But the ability to sort of create resonance was just very weak. I think it's, I mean, overall as an observation, I think you're right, Dorothea.
Dorothea, yeah.
Yeah.
The other part of her question is about the FDP, which we haven't spoken so much about. She's asking about internal party friction within the FDP. Maybe alluding to something there. So Dorothea, you can say more about that if you want to, but is that part of the question something you can respond to?
I can say something if you want. I mean, the way I see it, the FDP as a free market party, as I said, very much stood for a very doctrinaire, dogmatic neoliberalism. In terms of economic policy, I guess you can compare it to, the Tory party in Britain, although it's not a socially conservative party. That's the key difference. And I think now that they're in a moment of having to form a coalition, we will see quite serious tensions between pragmatic politicians who are very interested in becoming involved in a government, and people who are very, dogmatic neoliberals and don't want to make concessions. So that would be a first key tension. The second tension, I guess, in that party that has always played a certain role is that in the 1970s, there was still very much a force in favor of human rights, in favor of civil rights. As I said, they're not a socially conservative party, so there is a bit of a different alignment than in the Anglophone world. Free market politics aligned with a certain commitment to the rule of law and to a certain degree of human rights. And that's another tension, obviously, because arguably very strong forms of neoliberalism are neither particularly interested in democracy nor in human rights. They're in fact interested in shielding market results from people actually using their rights to advance their interests who are not in very strong positions in society. So in that sense, I guess there's a second tension there.
Yeah. Okay. So Chris has written a question which is really about the kind of co-opting of the workforce, the core industrial workforce. I mean, you can read this question as well at the same time, but it's really about older voters and where the kind of impetus for change in the longer term is going to come from. And there's a proposal that this is going to have to come from movements elsewhere in Europe. So this is an interesting kind of contextualization of what's going on in Germany, I think. Yeah, if you want to respond to that.
One detail, sort of the sort of younger people's vote, which is kind of interesting because and there are some sort of, I think, contradictory studies about this, but the most confusing sort of factoid I read last evening, which was people who voted for the first time in their lives, sort of because they just turned 18, were most likely to vote the FDP, the market radicals, and the Greens were second most likely. And for people under 30, the Greens are the most popular party by far, and then the FDP also is fairly popular, and then everyone else just after that. So older people have turned to the Social Democrats this time in large numbers, interestingly. But absolutely, it's true, the same dynamics as elsewhere. Older voters are much more likely to vote, and there's a lot of talk of a gerontocratic system there. Yes, and looking elsewhere for change, I mean, I guess it's definitely a reasonable conclusion from this election. I mean, on the other hand, you could argue that, you know, a sort of depending on sort of, I mean, going back one step, I do think that sort of the climate justice movement, even in its sort of, you know, mainstream forms, really did make a difference in shifting political debates recently in ways that I didn't really foresee. And if things like that do go on, a government of Scholz and the Greens can to some extent be pushed, you know, in a sort of centrist progressive direction. They'll have just kind of crazy internal tensions for sure. But it's definitely, I mean, that's sort of always the case in Germany, that you look for positive change elsewhere, pretty much. That's why it was such a dire situation when suddenly Angela Merkel was sort of supposed to be the liberal, progressive stronghold of Europe. I mean, of all people.
What I noticed in the coverage, the British coverage of the election, was that there was a kind of fascination with what they're calling Generation Merkel. And I don't know if this is just a fabrication of the UK media, but this notion that there's a generation who can't vote yet. They were speaking to many 16, 17-year-old young people. So is this remotely a meaningful constituency, this Generation Merkel, or is this a kind of distraction from what the real kind of allegiances and factions are, do you think?
think if we go by what first-time voters voted for, as Moritz said, there's very, very weak support for the CDU among young voters. And so I mean, obviously there is a generation Merkel, just as Moritz and I are part of the generation Kohl, meaning that for a very, very long time we've lived under one and the same chancellor, and when we were young it was Helmut Kohl and we knew nothing else, and for my kids it's Angela Merkel. But that generation, I think, is interesting, and the generational question is interesting because the question of climate change is so pressing. And I think, as elsewhere in the world, a lot of very, very young kids are getting involved in activism, which I think is amazing. I think is also a new development. I mean, their sheer youth. So 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds who are in the streets and who are involved in the climate justice protests. So obviously, there's never, you know, I find it very problematic to assume that they're generations and they're all the same and they are monolithic blocks. So in that sense, I guess the UK media is wrong. If anything, there is a mood among them that stuff needs to change because of climate change. And then obviously, you know, the different ideas about how this could happen. I wanted to briefly comment on the core workforces, because that's a question that also interests me very much as a labor scholar. So obviously Moritz has described this. There is a strong cooptation, and always has been. There are strong institutional links between the trade unions, very different history from Britain and the state. There are strong positions inside the state still for organized labor in Germany. And there are also mechanisms whereby organized labor in the form of trade unions have, or representatives of organized labor have agreed, for example, to the massive cutbacks under Schröder. This has led to certain divisions also among the core workforces. The rise of the left party is can partly be explained with that. So, you know, they're not monolithic in that sense. But what is also interesting is that the core workforces are dwindling. More and more people work in precarious jobs, and more people work in the service sectors, in the public sector. And I would say there are similar developments to Britain in the sense that there are very interesting forms of mobilization emerging around labor issues in those sectors, in those new sectors. So in that sense, yes, revitalization has to come from outside and from outside pressure, surely, but there are also certain things that are going on right now that are very interesting. For example, here in Berlin, where I'm sat right now, there's a big strike at hospitals, and the hospital workers aren't striking for higher wages, but for staff ratios, for better staff ratios, because they're saying we can't do this job anymore. It's just too stressful because of marketization, because of neoliberalization, and so forth. And what that does, in the US context, that's often called bargaining for the common good, is it directly creates an alliance between workers and patients. So the usual argument of, you know, if healthcare workers go on strike, you hit the patients, doesn't work, because they say, we're doing this not just for us, we're also doing this for our patients. And so public support for these strikes is very strong. And I think these kinds of developments are interesting and can force change from the inside, and possibly, hopefully, lead to a revitalization of organized labor in Germany, and to certain, strategies that are not as closely aligned with competitive corporatism.
That's very interesting. Scott McCracken has a question, which again is in the chat. And this is about the, he's saying that this fragmentation that you're describing is very familiar across many different countries since 2008, and indeed the rise of right-wing populism. But what interests him about your presentation is how Merkelism has managed to keep that right-wing populism in check until now. I think actually in the article you talk about the kind of real moment of challenge being back in the migration summer in 2015, but yeah, somewhat kept it in check. So Scott's asking, is this the case? Has she managed to keep it in check? Or does this relative weakness of the AfD conceal the radicalization of the traditional centre-right parties, such as in the US and the UK? So it's really, it's a really question about how right-wing populism is being kind of passed between the parties at the moment, I guess.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. So the AfD really started out as they call themselves a professor's party of liberal, market-oriented economics professors, largely, who were against the sort of European sort of financing. The way the euro is set up and the way German money might be used to bail out Southern European countries. They were sort of successful with that for some time, then really lost support, and then again sort of gained a lot of support in 2015. But they sort of joined forces with, so it was in the beginning sort of the economists, but then also people who felt that they'd been pushed out of Merkel's CDU because they were sort of really staunch social conservatives, and neo-Nazis of different stripes as well. And the latter, or I mean, they don't necessarily always are open neo-Nazis, but sort of folkish nationalists, ethnic nationalists. And they are sort of winning the internal faction wars mainly. Merkel has, and our argument was that Merkelism was exhausted because the AfD got so strong, or that was sort of the symptom, or the really the most important element of that process. They have not become more successful recently. However, they are really entrenched in some parts of Germany. So in this election, they managed to gain majorities in, I think, 14 out of 16 counties, something like that, in Saxony and in Thuringia. So in two pretty populous East German states in the south of the former East, the AfD is the strongest party, and it seems like they're not going to go away. So they're really a powerful political presence at this point, regionally, and present elsewhere as well, of course. So it isn't in check to some extent. I think what's really remarkable is that Merkel has managed to keep the CDU from forming coalitions with the AfD. There was a time, I think, in the state of Thuringia when that almost broke down, and they almost would have sort of had a government that was elected by a state government elected by the AfD, of conservatives and FDP. But Merkel and the then head of the Conservative Party, Kramp-Karrenbauer, sort of forced the state party to revise that decision. So there is a hardcore right faction within the CDU that really wants to take the option of forming coalitions with the AfD and forming sort of a new right-wing majority. Their spokesman, whom we also wrote about in the paper, Maaßen, the former head of the Domestic Intelligence Service, just now was not voted into parliament, but there was a big debate over whether the CDU should kick him out. And it was pretty clear that if Merkel had been more powerful, or it seemed likely that Merkel's people would have liked to kick him out, but the more sort of a big faction with Schäuble and others were against this and saw him, who's sort of a really hardcore right-winger, as part of the big tent of German conservatism, or under the fitting in there. The CDU is at this point not as crazy as the Republican Party by far, it has to be said. Laschet just simply isn't. There are forces within the CDU that might go in that direction. Laschet sort of also took them into his own team of experts, but they're not hegemonic and pretty far from it. But who knows where it will be in a few years, I would say.
Paul Hentz has just added a note about the kind of institutionalization of the AfD, I guess. And I wonder if you could explain that. I don't understand that process of receiving a political foundation. That's very interesting. So that might be worth explaining.
Yeah, we thought about talking about that in the talk, but we kicked it out. Alex, do you want to say something?
Yeah, there was also a question about the voting age. I can very, very briefly say I'm all in favor, considering how politicized that young generation is, and how much of an influence in an aging society old people have politically, and that needs to be countered, especially when it comes to ecological issues, but all sorts of other issues as well. Paul's point. Yeah, there is a system in Germany whereby parties in parliament are allowed to set up political foundations that are formally independent from those parties, but sort of politically aligned to a degree in their outlook on things. And a lot of you may know, for example, the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, which is also active in the UK, or the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, which are the political foundations of the SPD and the Left Party. And what happens is that taxpayers' money is used to fund those foundations, and these foundations then use this money for political education, for funding university students, for funding PhDs, and for funding all sorts of forms of knowledge production, really, that are somewhere between, say, activism and academia. So for people on the left, for example, the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation has been very, very important institutionally in terms of supporting research projects and political activities and so forth. And now that the AfD are an established force in German politics, they will get a political foundation, and through that political foundation, they can channel a lot of money into campaigns, they call political education and so forth.
Yeah. I am going to wrap us up because we think we might just get chucked out at 8 o'clock precisely. And I don't want to miss the opportunity of saying thank you very, very much to both of you. It was absolutely fantastic talk. And I think we all really appreciate the fact that you put so much energy into preparing this today for us. So thank you so much on behalf of everybody. And to the audience, thank you for coming. And as I say, our seminars do continue until the 8th of November. So you can join us every week for more on this conjuncture. So thank you very much indeed.